I would like to start by thanking all the donors, supporters of this publication. Dobel Tequila with its CEO Raphael Juan Domingo Beckman. Galeria Labor in Mexico City with Pamela Echeverria, who supported these publications since the beginning. Our partner publisher, which is RM Publisher House, RM, who will assure that the book has international distribution. I would also like to thank the chair of trustees of el Museo del Barrio, Maria Eugenia Mauri, who always supports and pushes every important activity and event of El Museo. Thank you for your commitment and your love for the institution. Also, special thanks to our invited editor, Javier Rivero Ramos, PhD candidate of the Department of Art and Archaeology of Princeton University. Gracias, Javier. Thank you. You did an amazing job. You worked really, really hard, hours of discussions with Raphael. You visited universities, you visited different archives, and the result is just amazing. At El Museo del Barrio, we believe that museums are not just platforms that organize exhibitions and build collections. We believe that cultural institutions are social institutions, and every museum has to engage with its communities. And we also believe that museums are platforms of education and research. The book of Raphael Montañez Ortiz is a good example, and well, we're celebrating precisely this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. Gracias a todos and welcome. I will now give the word to Javier Rivero Ramos, who will be conducting and guiding all the discussions and all the roundtables of this evening. Bienvenido, Javier.
Gracias, Patrick. Thank you for that introduction. So yeah, for tonight's event, we first had Patrick, of course, and now I'm going to give a little brief editorial introduction. Next, we're going to hear an excerpt from one of the authors of the book, followed by an artist's table, roundtable discussion, followed by a main roundtable, and I'm going to keep the participants for now a secret so as to foster intrigue and interest and keep you guys here with us. And then at the very end, we're going to have a brief Q&A, which will be open to all of us, the participants, in case you want to ask us anything. So as a matter of introduction, I guess I could start by saying that Raphael Montañez Ortiz has spent his life at the forefront of American art. And yet his work and its impact is not to be found in most surveys dedicated to the period. And this paradox has multiple roots. As a matter of presenting the book this evening and its editorial rationale, I would like to discuss briefly a couple of them. And more importantly, I'd like to explain to you how this paradox guided both myself and Estudio Herrera in putting together and in designing the book. Now, Chon Noriega, one of the foremost experts in the work of Raphael and one of the authors, contributors to the volume, has explained elsewhere how canonical art history has remained inimical to Ralph, partly due to systemic racist marginalization, but also, and perhaps more importantly, due to the fact that Ralph's work is very much against the discipline and very much against the archive. And in my own experience making this book, I could not agree with him more. Ralph's work defies the straitjackets of academic discipline. It bristles and refuses academia, even though Ralph himself is an academic. So that when we started editing this book, we quickly realized that the artworks themselves were not going to lend themselves to one of the main tools of art history, the monograph. right? So we had the task of putting together a monograph, anti-monograph of sorts. We quickly realized that the grid, the mise en page, the rectilinear group of photographs and venerable histories of collection and whatnot didn't really stand a chance in front of Ralph's work. Instead of a nice two-dimensional paintings, photographed in high resolution, I had stuff like a brief poem of sorts that Ralph wrote for an exhibition entitled Penny Candy and Fudge Assemblages that he curated in 1965. That reads, "Mother gooses with snow joes and flirtation hearts form a triangle around a sugar daddy with old-fashioned sour balls, while sour pickles with balls of fire form a circle around swizzled sticks with fruit-flavored hots." Right? I had that. I had the first sentence, the first of his recollection of the Destruction in Art Symposium, which reads, "It began with a phone call from my psychiatrist's friend's wife, the photographer Dina. Her message was to call Al Hansen. Al spoke of destruction finally getting its break." So we had this, right? We had everything except the kind of material that makes an art history book. So instead of trying to polish, to square it, to ask it to behave, we actually allowed for the work, or we tried to allow it for the work to guide us in its daring and in its unruliness, and the result is this book that is probably more like a whirlwind than the kind of book that we are used to. As for the authors, Kevin Hatch, Chon Noriega, Ana Cristina Perry, and Pedro Reyes, I won't say much. Any attempt by myself to try to synthesize their contributions to this volume and to the scholarship on Ralph would be a huge disservice. I will say, though, that the editorial task of finding authors was actually made quite easy, because there's not a lot of scholars or artists out there who have the teeth to take on Ralph's work. So without further ado, I would like to actually pass on the mic to one of the authors of the volume, and who will be reading an extract from his essay in the book. Kevin Hatch is Associate Professor of Art History at Binghamton University. His research focus is art of the 20th and 21st centuries, with a particular interest in America after World War II. He has published essays on the artists Ed Ruscha, Roy Lichtenstein, and Wally Hendrick, among others. His book, Looking for Bruce Conner, was published by MIT Press in 2012. So everybody, please visually join me in welcoming Kevin.
Thank you so much, Javier. So, and I'm the crazy art historian who tried to, deal with what you're talking about. So I'm going to, what I was asked to do was read an excerpt from my essay. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to share my screen. So let's hope this works, but I've got a slide presentation with some videos and still images. So here we go. And if you're new to Zoom, you can sort of shrink the little pictures over on the right by hitting the single block instead of the grid there on the top right. Javier, I can see you. Does this look good and sound good? All right. Great. Okay. All right. So great. So hi, everyone. I first want to say that it was a genuine honor to be asked to be part of this project. Raphael Montañez Ortiz is exactly the kind, Raphael Montañez Ortiz is exactly the kind of artist I find myself drawn to think about. In general, I'm drawn to artists who are not just left out of the story that gets told about art after World War II, but who in fact resist being absorbed into that story. This rhymes with what Javier was saying, who resist the canon in some profound way. I'm thinking of artists like Bruce Conner and Corita Kent, known before 1968 as Sister Mary Corita Kent, both of whom I show here along with Ralph. None of these artists fits neatly into art history as it's been written, and of course, there are many others too. Of course, the stakes of this resistance to being absorbed differ sharply from artist to artist. In the case of Montañez Ortiz, a Latinx artist working in unconventional media, looking back, we can see how he's been orphaned, to use Chon Noriega's useful term, orphaned, which is to say he's been largely ignored by both historians of the post-war avant-garde and scholars of specifically Latinx art. As Noriega points out, this orphaning is a predictable result of the fundamentally racist structure of art historical institutions, which remain hostile to people of color. But Noriega has also noted that rectifying the situation is not as simple as reintroducing a lost or forgotten figure into an ever-expanding canon. Instead, and here again I'm echoing Javier, instead he's argued that it means taking seriously an artist who actively works against the archive, against the system of rules, both explicit and implicit, that governs what counts, who is granted visibility, and so on. In other words, Montañez Ortiz's resistance to absorption into post-war art history is not a flaw, but rather a potent characteristic of a career that now spans 7 decades. I have found that when a body of work is as refractory as that of Montañez Ortiz, even when it gets mentioned by art historians, the work itself is rarely given the close attention it deserves. So that is what I got to do in this commission. And the closer I looked, the more I realized that the artwork, and in this case his early films, which is my focus, was of a piece with the artist's highly self-aware approach to what we might call the post-war media sphere, that mix of new communications technologies, new labor forms, leisure practices that came into being in the 1940s and 50s and continues to shape our everyday life. Montañez Ortiz has been highly adept at navigating this media sphere, both as an activist and an artist, and the art he's made has fiercely confronted the most malign aspects of that media sphere, especially in the intervention into cinema that he made in the late 1950s, and which will be my focus this evening. But the first thing I want us to look at is not a film, but rather a magazine spread. It's from the August 1966 issue of the London-based periodical Art and Artists, which I'm showing you here. The spread includes a statement by the artist, it's on the left there, which has the incantatory quality of a cinematic voiceover. The ocean is ageless and was here long before we were here. It is primeval. Where it meets the land, that is where consciousness begins. It is at that edge, so to speak, that my art begins, always with the danger of being swept away. Alongside the text, 4 photographs of the artist's work, Chair Destruction, appear in high contrast black and white. The first photograph on the top there is a panoramic view of a beach with Montañez Ortiz sitting in an upholstered armchair dwarfed by rolling waves. Below the panorama, 3 snapshots arranged as a triptych record the artist's destruction of the armchair with an axe. In the first image, he's captured mid-swing, the chair as yet unharmed. In the second, the chair is no longer intact, but lying in pieces at the artist's feet. In the final photograph, we see Montañez Ortiz cradling the chair's entrail-like remains in his arms. His face is top lit, with the lines of his handsome face carved in sharp relief. His brow is slightly furrowed, and he gazes into a distance we cannot see, off screen, as it were. This photo spread points us to a consistent, if under-examined, aspect of I'm sorry, apparently I'm nervous talking into Zoom and freaking out. An under-examined aspect of the artist's long career, namely his extraordinary aptitude for creative self-fashioning, whether in text, performance, photograph, or moving image. In this instance, the artist presents himself as the quintessential existential protagonist, alone, confronting the unfathomable vastness of the natural world. The panoramic photograph that shows him seated before the ocean is rich with resonances, from Caspar David Friedrich's painting Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog to the windswept seascapes of Michelangelo Antonioni's 1960 film La Ventura. The echo of Antonioni is particularly suggestive, as it is not just the panorama that recalls cinema. In fact, each of the photographs has the look of a film still, with the artist cast as the ultimate neo-realist anti-hero. Beyond his self-fashioning, the appearance of the photograph in a magazine is itself significant, for it indicates an artist who is keenly media savvy, both in gaining and shaping mass media coverage, and more significantly, in grasping the operations by which post-war American life was becoming increasingly media saturated. Evidence of his ability to court media attention is plentiful, clearest perhaps in his actions related to the first Destruction in Art Symposium that took place in London in September 1966. That's what Javier was referring to. As the artist recalled, writing a few months after the event, the soon-to-be infamous actions he undertook during the symposium were preceded by a press conference during which reporters peppered him with incredulous questions. "Do you seriously intend to kill a chicken as art, Mr. Ortiz?" His ability to generate media buzz was impressive, eventually extending to television as well. Among multiple appearances on broadcast TV in the late 1960s was a spot on the BBC, which I show here, as well as on NBC's The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, during which he smashed a piano in a performance he dedicated on air to Glenn Gould. By 1968, the artist's national reputation as a destroyer of pianos was so secure that he could go unnamed in a New Yorker cartoon in which a stage performer beating the instrument with a baseball bat instead of the trademark axe was criticized for tampering with the score. Montañez Ortiz's media exploits did much to bring international attention to destruction art, if only for a brief time. Yet engagement with media outlets posed its own hazards, as the press most often presented him either as ghoulish and threatening, chicken killer, or harmless and comic, the gleeful piano smasher, inspiring a fad for similar demolitions on American college campuses. To avoid both of these caricatures, it becomes necessary to take his work seriously and on its own terms, and to take him seriously, not only as a media artist, a label he embraced, but also as a media theorist, which is to say, someone who intervened at a material and theoretical level in an increasingly mediatized post-war image world in order to test its boundaries and probe its blind spots. The artist adopted an intermedial approach from the very beginning of his career. He enrolled at Pratt Institute in New York as an architecture student in 1953, switched to fine arts to study painting, but then spent much of his time reading philosophy and developmental psychology. He had previously attended New York's High School for Industrial Art, where many creatively gifted African-American and Latinx students were funneled, despite his having qualified for admission to the city's almost exclusively white, fine arts-focused High School of Music and Art. He has cited this early encounter with systemic racism as formative. The artist's earliest mature work, begun as a graduate student at Pratt, evolved from painting in an abstract expressionist vein into working in a manner of his own devising, in which he built up and pulled away layers of paint-soaked paper towels on the surfaces of canvases. I'm showing you one of these here. At the same time, he began to experiment with cinema, and his ideas regarding destruction began to coalesce. So the contours of Montañez Ortiz's early incursions into cinema are by now well established. And here I'm showing one of the early films so you get a sense of it. His process involved purchasing inexpensive 8mm and 16mm prints sold in travel stores and camera shops, and editing the film strips directly by cutting and splicing them by hand. The films of this type that were available in the late 1950s varied widely and included news compilations, documentaries, educational films, and shortened versions of Hollywood movies, all of which were intended for home viewing. In an interview from 1994, the artist described his working process to the film scholar Scott McDonald. I would chop the films up with a tomahawk and put them into a medicine bag. I would shake it, and for me, the bag would become a rattle, and I would chant with it. I was always trying to find some process, some activity that would connect what I was doing with the indigenous sacred. I was imitating indigenous ritual to find my place within it. When I had chanted long enough and felt comfortable with my ritual, then I would reach into the medicine bag, pull out pieces of chopped up film, and randomly splice them together. As McDonald notes, he used bits taken from recognizable scenes along with Countdown Leader and other parts of the physical film strip the audience was never meant to see. And he joined the segments without paying attention to their original orientation. And you can see, right, like just then, something the audience was not supposed to see. The artist was thorough in his atomizing procedure. The technician who transferred the delicate film strips to video in the mid-1990s counted over 700 cuts in one 2-minute long film, which is insane. He was every bit the amateur, fixing the fragments with fragile cement splices, and it is a minor miracle that any of the films exist today. Of the 16 films he estimates he sacrificed in this way, 2 have survived: Cowboy and Indian film, which I just showed you, and Newsreel, both from 1957 to 1958. Ralph's recollection of his filmmaking process, with its reference to the indigenous sacred, indicates its inseparability from the research he was doing at the time on his own multi-ethnic identity. It also reveals how, in his early films, the spiritual, political, and medial intersected in a powerful way. He has linked Cowboy, reconstituted from fragments of the 1950 Western Winchester 73, to experimentation with peyote and his awakening to an identity as a minority, both of which inflected the Western as a genre for him. As he satirically asked, "What am I doing cheering for the cavalry?" Later commentators have concluded that the films were utterly shattered or destroyed in the process of their making. These are terms used in the literature. But we should be more precise about the destruction that is involved in these found footage films. There are, after all, many ways to destroy, with the most infamous in the history of post-war art likely being Robert Rauschenberg's methodical erasing of a Willem de Kooning drawing in 1953, and the results there on the left. In contrast, Ralph opted for chopping, a kinetic bodily means of engaging with the celluloid strip that led directly to the intensely physical public actions he would begin to perform in the mid-1960s. However, even to speak of destruction here seems imprecise. After all, the film is not actually obliterated. In the case of Cowboy, for example, not only the physical film strip, but also the narrative of Winchester 73 while battered and beaten, still survives. And if you see in that film that you were watching, you can still sort of get it, even though it's completely refunctioned. The original film weaves a familiar story, the hunt for a fugitive around a rifle that changes hands a number of times before landing in the hands of the film's hero, played by Jimmy Stewart. One of several characters who lay claim to the rifle is an Indian chief named Young Bull, played by Rock Hudson in Red Face. In the film, the order and orientation of shots, taken from an already condensed version of the movie, are subjected to severe chance operations. Nevertheless, the ability of the film to reconstitute itself as narrative is surprisingly tenacious. So familiar is the Western, and so ingrained are its visual codes and prejudices, that the original story plagues its reconstructed version like a zombie. In short, the film, as both a physical and a cultural object, clings to life while bearing the marks of tremendous strain. This state of aggravated distress is even more prominent and significant in Newsreel of the same year, 1958. In this case, the artist took his footage from a compendium of notable news from the year 1946, that is the year after World War II ended. From the momentous, such as the sentencing of 12 former Nazi officials at the Nuremberg trials, to the trivial, such as the 50th anniversary of the invention of the automobile. The artist's chopping and reordering of film fragments led to bizarre sequences, such as one in which Pope Pius XII appears to bless a mushroom cloud arising from a nuclear detonation. You will see it if you watch carefully. In contrast to Cowboy, in Newsreel, which runs just under 2 minutes, there's no possibility of anything approaching a story or narrative, given the radical reordering of frames taken from a source that was already heterogeneous. This non-narrativity is intensified with the speed of the cuts, and again, hundreds across just 2 minutes of runtime. But this violent process, the chopping and the gluing, leads to an unexpected result, namely the repetition of specific images within the film's brief running time. The viewer of Newsreel, so all of us here, witnesses all or part of a mushroom cloud, not once at the end, as in the 1946 original. The original sort of ends with this, and we also blew up, an atom bomb. So not just once at the end, but by my count, over 70 separate times, spread more or less evenly across the running time of the film, though each time appearing for only a fraction of a second. The same can be said of the footage documenting the Nuremberg trials, of a menacing noose that you saw that hangs in an empty cell, Pope Pius XII himself, and several other bits of footage. In Newsreel, the ritualized, cathartic actions of chanting, chopping, shaking, and reattaching allowed the artist to release the evil, suffusing the cultural object of the original film, that is the 1946 documentary. However, it's significant that the evil thus released remains present. To assume otherwise would be to misunderstand the artist's role as that of some kind of purifying agent. Instead, as the artist himself has noted, his approach in these early films was shamanic, entering an altered state in the pursuit of specialized knowledge hidden within an object. By releasing the evil from a newsreel, cataloging the militaristic exploits of the post-war political order, newsreel exposes how that evil is hidden in the products of our increasingly media-saturated world. In this case, the omnipresent threat of nuclear war that's made harrowingly present for the full 2 minutes of the film. In the artist's early films, just as in his later performances, a conflict is staged. The stakes are high, and the malevolent aspects of society are never vanquished, though they are brought out into the open with violent force. Such are the perilous operations of destruction art, especially where it intersects with instruments of the mass media, such as cinema and television. In the following years, Ralph would go on to more fully explore the political and psychoanalytic implications of his sophisticated and difficult mode of destruction. While his direct engagement with cinema was brief, its ability to enact a risky give and take nonetheless remained potent for him for years afterwards. During the performances for which he would become best known, possibly, cathartic, often bloody rituals that pushed his own body and the bodies of others to extremes. He would sometimes project his early found footage films above the stage. As Montañez, as Ralph remarked, I don't know what's going on with me. As Ralph remarked, looking back at an interview from 2011, it's displacing, it's moving away, distancing away from yourself, the way a magician works. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, for that, for reading us that excerpt from your essay, which I think is a really meaningful contribution both to film and media theory, as well as through Ralph's. I try to say Ralph myself as a little trick, and I see that we're actually, so thank you very much. And again, everybody, all of those who have your cameras on, please join me in thanking Kevin. I really miss the auditory in these things. Thanking Kevin for his presentation. I see that we are actually running I feel like it was fantastic, and of course it's amazing to think of something so prescient and innovative being done in 1957, right? And yeah, you leave it to Ralph to put both Pope Pius X and Brock Hudson and Redface at play in the same gesture. So we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, so I'd like to take another moment to show everybody a copy of this very important book. A link that we have on the chat for all of those of you who would like to go ahead and purchase it already. I'm sure that we've already convinced some of you to do it. And just to show you guys the kind of material that we included in the book, and kind of playing off the fact that Kevin was reading from a couple of the newspaper clippings. One of the things that we found the hardest about the book was to limit and to restrain ourselves in terms of how many news clippings we were going to include, because some of the journalists were pretty dumbfounded, and the way that they described what they were looking at is pretty fantastic. Here I am reading a little excerpt from the Des Moines Sunday Register, November 9th, 1969. And I read, Ortiz entered, shouted, "Peace," and promptly put a hammerlock on Hugh Lifson, assistant professor of art at Cornell. This signaled a pushing, grabbing, wrestling match among the participants as they jostled startled members of the audience. All the while they shouted "peace" at the top of their lungs. The title of the article is, "Well, maybe you don't understand art. First you go to an Iowa slaughterhouse for 15 glasses of blood, then take an axe to the old piano and yell, 'Peace, peace.'" So with that, I would like to move us on to our next portion of tonight's book launch. And this is an artist roundtable, where we will have 3 participants, Juan Sanchez, Marcos Dimas, and Pedro Reyes, who will be talking about the impact that Ralph's work has had on their own work. So Juan Sanchez is an American artist and one of the most important Nuyorican cultural figures to emerge in the second half of the 20th century. These include photography, paintings, and mixed media works. His pieces are held in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, among others. Marcos Dimas is a world-renowned contemporary artist whose work has set standards of innovative excellence. His work combines pre-Columbian Taino symbols with contemporary modes of abstraction and figuration, to create a fusion between past and present ways of seeing. Mr. Dimas is also, very importantly, one of the original founders of Taller Boricua. Pedro Reyes is a Mexican artist who has won international attention for large-scale projects that address current social and political issues. Reyes explores the power of individual and collective organization to incite change through communication, creativity, happiness, and humor. In 2011, he curated the exhibition Laserdisc Scratch Destruction, Raphael Montañez Ortiz at Galeria Labor in Mexico City, which was a very important source for the present book. So without further ado, please everybody join me in welcoming our three presenters for the next panel.
Is any of us are gonna speak first? Is there any order?
I mean, I'm supposed to be moderating, but I would find it against the purpose of Ralph to try to moderate anything. But yes, the way that we thought we could do this is each of you guys sort of starting and talking a little bit briefly about the impact of Ralph's work on your own or your relationship to it. And then we can sort of move it on from there. And Pedro, since you sort of jumped the gun, why don't you go ahead and start yourself?
Well, it's true that Ralph has been a big influence in my practice. And I think that I came across his work first through a film critic in Mexico called Enrique Ortiga, who was living below my apartment and told me, you have to see this. And he pulled out some videotapes and showed me the laser, the scratch disc videos, which left me totally hooked and blissfully traumatized. I don't know what is like the kind of a way to express it, but it was as my mind was raped or something. And I loved it. It was like a really, really powerful experience. And then, you know, like my interest started to grow, and I came across like some writings of Chon Noriega, of course, you know, like who was the reference. And then, or is, and then eventually I wrote to Julián Zubazagoitia, who was the director of Museo del Barrio back then, asking for Ralph's address, and then wrote Ralph an email asking to visit him in New Jersey. And started a conversation which led later to the exhibition I curated at Pamela Echeverria's Galeria Labor. In that trip to New Jersey, I have a supernatural experience, which was a session of psychophysioalchemy conducted by Ralph himself, who asked me to lay down in the floor and taught me how to do this past life regression. And I went to another time. I made a kind of an astral trip that sent me to another time in history where I saw myself as a different person, and I had a number of fantasy visions that felt very real, and I came back from that trip guided by Ralph, who really guided me in an experience that I cannot be anything short of a true shamanic experience. And one that it was at the same time, you know, like within the framework of contemporary art, which is or church. No? So it was like especially meaningful. And so I actually would like to show an image. I think I can. Let me see if I can. Yes, I'm gonna show you this image here, which is, I asked Ralph for permission to restage the same process that he had taught me in the context of a project I did called Sanatorium, which was organized by the Guggenheim Museum in 2011, and which was a kind of a mix of art and psychology and a number of experimental therapies. So I took physio-psychoalchemy and did this iteration where, you know, like there's a group of people sitting in a circle with these balloons that are pressed by the knees, and I replicated what Ralph had taught me in doing these breathing exercises that induce a trance, and where you led the people who are making the experience to this state of deep intuition, deep meditation and deep trance. And everybody goes somewhere because we all have a very active imagination and a fantasy that is, you know, like or what our mind produces, even if it's not fed with inputs from the outside, but more from the inside. And then at the end, following very much also, like after seeing some of the tapes of these experiments that Ralph was doing in the 80s, people would come out of the trip and then do a sort of sharing, talking to the person next to them, where had they been in this transmigration, express transmigration experience. So that is one of the, you know, like I don't know if it's like so much of an influence. I would like, I mean, like I would think it was like I was stealing from Ralph if Ralph had not like gave me this gift and allowed me to do it, because there was not much that I added to it. But as generous as he is, it was like a very, very nice gift. And that's just one example that perhaps there's many other works that, you know, like or other more kind of general thoughts that I think that not necessarily have impacted me in my work, but in my life, especially because esoteric dimensions sometimes are a bit of a taboo in art, you know, like in the sense that we produce a lot of, we have the kind of tendency to over-rationalize, no, our work. So I think that one of the biggest lessons from the work of Ralph is to allow ourselves as artists to do this, to take teachings from different traditions and to incorporate them in this aesthetic dimension, which is for us our spiritual dimension.
I appreciate the thing that you said, Pedro, because my experience with Raphael Montañez Ortiz has been the kind of experience that definitely opened my mind in terms of the power and the potential of art as a art student. And as I evolved throughout the years, I've always have taken a very strong social political stance in my work. And that's something that was prevalent during my undergraduate years and my graduate years. When I attended Rutgers University, Mason Grove School of the Arts, we're talking about 1978 through 1980. Before I entered that MFA program, I never heard of Raphael Montañez Ortiz. I heard rumors about him. I heard rumors that he's teaching at Livingston College, and that his classes was very strange and unorthodox. And that didn't really attract me to find him as much as the fact that he's a Puerto Rican artist. He's an artist that was one of the founders of the Museo del Barrio. And I've seen bits and pieces of his work, particularly his burn mattress pieces. And I've seen images of one of many performances in relation to his tearing down of pianos. So I just took the opportunity to come to a couple, maybe 3 or 4 of his classes, just to audit the class, to check them out. And when I met him, he was extremely welcoming, and he did give me permission. So I came in. And I kind of came in like in the middle of the session. I came in a bit late, rushing from my other class. And he had the students laid on the floor, and he was doing a series of different breathing exercises on the ground. And then he would have them sit up and do similar breathing exercises. And I thought it was kind of like interesting. I mean, I said, is this an art class, or is this a yoga class, or what, you know? But after I've seen the way he conducted his class, me and him got into a conversation, and I was so privileged to visit him at some point. And he really got into this whole conversation about the physical and the metaphysical, and the bridges in between that, and how the metaphysical in some form or another is a major part of your life, and how you process life, and how you go through some kind of a metamorphosis to make that life even more tangible. And of course, you know, being aware of who we are, you know, we have our roots, you know, in terms of African culture, indigenous Taino culture, in addition to, you know, Catholic culture coming from Spain, from Europe, you know. I mean, he connected me immediately, because I come from a household where my mother was very religious, and she did all kinds of rituals at home. Especially during the Easter holidays and other holidays. And so I had a real clear understanding. He reconnected me to my history, to my family experience. And at the same time, he made me understand that what he's doing was not necessarily just destroying things. He's kind of like reconstructing, and creating another sense of being, another sense of history. Those films that Pedro spoke about, I was fortunate for him to to show me those very films that he did. And he also showed me some equipment that Sony has sent him to experiment with these large laser discs. It was the beginning of that technology, and he was one of the artists that was given this equipment to experiment and to play with it and to report to them what he had done with it. And so I always felt that he's a pioneer. You know, he's someone who is trying so hard to take art to that level, which is indeed spiritual, but most important, transformational. And that had an impact in my work because all of a sudden I began to realize that I grew up in the kind of environment where the spiritual, the rituals coming from various sources, be it African, Taino, Spanish, Catholic, is something that has been so inside of me and has begun to surface in my work. So in meeting him, he justified, he has confirmed in me that this is a part of the work that I have to also integrate into my own. And I felt that because of his understanding of his roots and how he spreads out to not only in terms of African or Puerto Rican, Taino, North America, especially the North American Indians, but he's also gone so far out into Latin America and also embrace his own Mexican roots. You know, I feel that his work is about transcendence. And that's what I try so hard, which is quite a challenge, to be political, social, and so on and so forth. How can I make this work transcendent so that the viewer, the spectator, can connect with that work on a more spiritual, more emotive level? At the same time, I kind of felt that Ralph, from the get-go, has always been a universal artist, you know, and an artist in the purest sense of the word. And I always felt that his methodology is like tearing apart this canon, this Western perspective on art and self-expression, deconstructing that, reconstructing it to something that is more authentic and more indigenous to who we are as a people, not only in terms of our own history, but the history that so many people share around the world. And that's why I feel that he's extremely universal. So I just want to leave it at that, because I kind of feel that his work continues to impact me. The fact that I'm in this program and hearing the speakers and hearing a little bit of the text and all of that, it's quite nurturing and it's quite reaffirming, and that's why I'm not in the least embarrassed or apologetic in terms of whatever direction my work takes, whether it's very political. You know, I'm pro-independence and I've gone out into the street, you know, for human rights and so on and so forth. But so has Ralph Ortiz. He's been out there with so many artists picketing against MoMA, picketing against other institutions that doesn't represent in the least at that time any artists of color. He joined forces with artists of color. He was one of the founding members of El Museo del Barrio, while at the same time, the Studio Museum in Harlem was taking place. So in whatever direction he went, he was always in unity, in unison with everything else that was going on at the same time. In terms of the Puerto Rican Young Lords Party, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Liberation Movement, he echoed all of these things, but in ways that was universal and embracing, you know. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Marcos, are you?
Yes, I am. Okay.
Take it away.
I'll take over where Juan left off. I was involved with Raphael Ortiz way back. I came back from the Army during the Vietnam War, and I joined the School of Visual Arts. During my tenure at School of Visual Arts, there would be meetings of the Art Workers Coalition at the school, and together with some of my colleagues, Armando Soto, Adrian Garcia, Martin Rubio, we joined the Art Workers Coalition, and in joining the Art Workers Coalition, we met Ralph Ortiz. Ralph Ortiz came to be more or less like the leader of our group, because eventually the Art Workers Coalition broke off into like different factions. The blacks were led by Tom Lloyd and Faith Ringgold. And then there was the general white population of artists, and the Puerto Rican artists were basically Ralph and the group, our group, which is basically from the School of Visual Arts. So we participated in a lot of the demonstrations. My first demonstration was against the Museum of Modern Art. The Museum of Modern Art was hosting an exhibition of the Surrealists. And the Surrealists was originally an anti-war movement. And we, the Art Workers Coalition, was an anti-war movement. So we felt that that MoMA was co-opting the history of the struggle against a war in that venue. We became a nucleus of Puerto Ricans within the Art Workers Coalition. And then I started to see Ralph's work, and I was definitely I was impressed, and I did a lot of the work. A lot of my early work was constructions and assemblages, being influenced by Ralph Ortiz. Eventually, we wavered throughout New York City in demonstrations where we demonstrated against the Metropolitan Museum. We demonstrated against the Museum of the City of New York. And as a solidarity, we created a day without art after the Kent State Massacre. We decided that we were going to close the New York City, all museums, in solidarity with the Kent State Massacre. And that was called A Day Without Art. I also participated in the Harlem, it was called Harlem on My Mind Metropolitan Exhibition, where the exhibition covered Harlem, but did not cover the contemporary Black artists. So the Black artists, of course, felt left out. You know, they painted a pretty picture of Harlem in the Renaissance, you know, and but left all the contemporary artists out. Those same contemporary artists were like Juan mentioned, were the ones that evolved into the Studio Museum in Harlem. The Studio Museum in Harlem, located at 125th Street and 5th Avenue on the second floor, with Ada Mola, Ernie Crislow, Faye Ringo was involved with all that. Tom Lloyd was you could say he was like the leader of the Black group, you know? And so we did that, and we took over Thomas Hoban's office. Thomas Hoban was the executive director of the Metropolitan Museum. And I'd like to read a couple of things I have here, which relate to that. The Art Workers Coalition artist group formed in the midst of the anti-war movement, but it was also concerned with domestic racism and repression. The Art Workers Coalition militated for multicultural representation in the city's museum, as well as for artist representation on the museum's board of trustees. We were part of this decentralization committee, and the decentralization committee, the idea was to force the city's museums to spread their artistic wealth out to the boroughs, the barrios, and to make storefront branches of the museums in community centers in different neighborhoods, to make the Met share its pre-Columbian hoardings with the East Harlem community. And Ralph Ortiz was in front of that. And at the same time, Ralph Ortiz was founding el Museo del Barrio. And we, the cadre of artists that were involved, became members of the advisory committee to the Museo del Barrio. And there at the Museo del Barrio, I stumbled on the first Taino images that I saw, which Ralph was already collecting as part of the Museo del Barrio's directory. And throughout all that, we made contacts with the Barrio, with the Real Great Society, and with the Urban Planning Studio, which were two groups of Puerto Ricans that were doing work in East Harlem. Also part of that, Ralph Ortiz had Marimar Benitez working with him at that time. Marimar Benitez, who was married to Harry Quintana, who also became part of our group. And from there, we went on to demonstrate throughout till we decided to, the museums are not gonna change their policies. We're hitting a stone wall. Let's just create our own institutions. And that's when we created the Taller Boricua. That's when we formed the Taller Boricua in East Harlem. And we came to East Harlem, and we were grandfathered in by the Real Great Society. They gave us a building, and the building was right across the street from the Young Lords Party. And from there, we initiated a printing studio where we did a lot of the posters that were used that were used by the Young Lords and the Movimiento Pro Independencia de Puerto Rico. So anyway, that's in a nutshell. That was my my history, with Ralph Ortiz, and I could keep talking later on more about that, but that was the beginnings. That was the beginnings of everything that's still going on today.
Thank you so much, Marcos. And I think you're actually quite right in saying that I feel like all three presenters have, I mean, I feel like we have a lot to say, and probably it should be better if we move on so that people can start formulating their questions. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to have a Q&A at the end. So if our attendees, our guests here tonight, you guys have any questions, you can start posting them in the chat, and we will be fielding them towards the end, directing them specifically to a participant if that's what he would prefer, or maybe keeping it a little bit more broadly. I would like to just say that blissfully traumatized should have been the title of the book, but you know, yeah. Maybe for the eventual errata we can talk. So we're gonna move on to our main roundtable of the night, and I have once again the honor to introduce you to a conversation featuring three very special speakers and what promises to be a very lively and special conversation. Ana Cristina Perry is PhD candidate in art history at the City University of New York the City University of New York's Graduate Center. She is the 2019-2020 Smithsonian American Predoctoral Fellow in Latinx Art and a 2020-21 IUPLR Mellon Fellow. These fellowships support her dissertation examining the artistic and curatorial projects created by Raphael Montañez Ortiz from 1966 through 1972. She has also held the curatorial fellowship at the Whitney Museum of American Art and the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Chon Noriega, professor at the Department of Film, Television, and Digital Media at UCLA and director of the Chicano Studies Research Center, which holds the archives of Ralph. Chon has diverse research interests in film and the other arts, avant-garde film and video, in conjunction of film and television history, racial, gender, and sexual difference within both alternative and national cinemas, and media access for underrepresented groups. He is the author of Shot in America, Television, the State, and the Rise of Chicano Cinema, and co-author of Phantom Sightings, Art After the Chicano Movement, and LA Chicano. So everybody, oh, right, yeah. And last, but certainly not least, the man of the hour, prolific artist, performer, writer, educator, founder and first director of the Museo del Barrio, Dr. Raphael Montañez Ortiz, distinguished professor of art at Rutgers University's Mason Ross School of the Arts, builder and destroyer, Raphael Montañez Ortiz. So everybody, please help me in welcoming our speakers. Oh, and yes, so sorry, as a way to introduce this, we thought that what we could do is sort of, again, I'm going to try to moderate this, although I'll just kind of try to keep us in time. The way that we thought that we could do is sort of talk about the historical arc of Ralph's work. And in order to get us going, I know that Ralph wanted to kick us off by reading an excerpt from an article published in Art in America in 1971. We're going to put a link up for those of you who would like to see it and maybe, see it. So Ralph, if you're there, please take it away.
Yeah, interesting. That reference you made to Candy was an experience that grew out of my student days during the summers, working here and there, generally in some resort area, waiting on tables or working on the kitchen. And well, in the process, I met this candy maker who opened up a series of candy stores on Massachusetts in the areas, vacation areas like Provincetown. And so I went to work there. You know, a few of friends of mine, we got into my car, my Chevy, you know, the Latino favorite car, and drove up to Cape Cod and started work at this candy store. It was one of these penny candy stores that had like hundreds and hundreds of penny candies from the 20s and 30s and the 40s and so on. And I then wanted to become sort of a kind of an expert of candy. And I went to the library and got a few books on how to make fudge on these giant copper kettles, and peanut brittle and taffy and so on. And started making fudge in the window. It was on the main street in Provincetown. And of course, everyone passing by, it was kind of like a Walt Disney movie, you know, just sort of the scent sort of drifting by and carrying someone into the store. And they would spend, it was fascinating. Once they got a basket, they were each given a basket to fill with candies. And then those of us who were at the counters, we'd be at the counter counting off how much, you know, like this is 2 cents, this is 10 cents, 20 cents, 40, 50, and then we started adding all sorts of abstract figures. That'll be $20, you know, kind of thing. Anyway, out of that experience, I decided to have an art exhibit of artworks made from candy. And so that manifesto grew out of that experience, and creating the works of candy art. I sold a few of them. Most people ate them before they exhibited them. And that was the penny candy experience I had, creating artworks. In a sense, that was part of my challenge, always trying to find, to make candy dream, to make computers dream, to make us dream. And especially that becomes more obvious in the works of the psychophysio alchemy that Pedro discussed. As for the article that I was going to read, I mean, it's basically a lot of the ideas that I would be explored in that article. It's the 1972 article in Art in America, in case anyone wants to sort of track it down. It's simple, it's direct, and explains what motivated me to initiate, and that already Juan discussed quite a bit, and so did Marcos. So I feel, rather than to conserve time, not have to necessarily read that, and certainly it's available to be read. I'm so
well, I mean,
let me finish. I mean, this is amazing experience. I'd never expected this. I had a professor at Pratt Institute who put up with a lot of my shenanigans, as he called them, and I understood why. It turns out, in the end, I discovered it was Richenberg, not Rauschenberg, Professor Richenberg, that he himself was pretty well known during the early Expressionist period in painting in New York. And I would come in with all sorts of strange things, like a ravaged, you know, a cushion that I had been sitting on and doing some meditation, and which I tore apart and burned and so on. And all of the students would say, "What, you know, this a madman." And meanwhile, Rauschenberg would ask me to sort of develop an entire narrative around the work. And finally, one day, I uncovered the fact that he was in the Second World War a demolition expert, right? So, okay, that made sense, right? He just saw my taking that whole sort of process and finding its roots in the Aboriginal culture and as a process of reconciling and finding one's, I would call it strange relationship in terms of the Aboriginal history of culture to God and to deal with all sorts of mysteries. And the whole idea of the reconciling and all of the rituals were processes of reconciliation. And it was a question of understanding all the different kinds of things that were being reconciled and the kind of rituals and processes and how they affected in a transformative way one's sort of cognitiveness, one's psyche in relation to all of this phenomena that was happening around them and us in creation. One of the things as you listen to me is I enjoy segueing. Okay, so that way I don't bore myself with my ideas. I'm always shifting. It's sort of like sometimes a jujitsu with my own mind as to where I'm going to go as an artist. Okay, and again, I want to thank all of you. This is heartfelt for me, and it's like more than made my day. It's like you've made my life.